Can you not put that on yet, please? Yeah. No? Yeah, perfect. Thanks. It's been an amazing day. We've covered so much, and I know you're all really tired. So I'll try to keep it short. So let me start with the big picture. What do we know? Well, we started off with an amazing opening session where we talked, or where our keynote speaker talked about some theories about what's happening to democracy, that it's thinning out or it's being hollowed out. And we also heard about why it matters that those things are happening to democracy, and why it matters more specifically that voters are not turning up in the same sort of numbers that they once did. And the explanation for why it matters, first of all, to exactly quote, bad politicians are elected by good people who don't vote. The second thing, though, and it was a theme that kept recurring throughout the day, is that it also makes a difference in terms of the policies that we end up with. Or as Heather just talked about, the cycle of mutual neglect, which I thought was a great way of putting it. So there are policy implications because it's not a broad cross-section of people who don't show up. It's actually a more specific targeted group of people. And because they are absent, it does have spill-on effects. And David also talked about the inequality spiral, which I thought was another great term for the ongoing effects that happen when good people don't show up to vote. Because decisions are made by those who show up. So that sets out a pretty powerful framework for why it matters and why we're talking about this today. We also know that the trend of declining voter turnout is long and it's strong. We got some comfort in knowing that we're not alone in New Zealand. We're in pretty good company, actually, in terms of declining voter turnout. We know a lot about it, and hopefully coming here today, we all know a little bit more than when we arrived. But there's still a lot more we need to know. This is just the start. I also think that what the Electoral Commission did today was a timely thing. We're not in crisis in New Zealand yet in terms of voter turnout. So this is the perfect time to put it on our radar screen, to start talking about it, because it's going to take some time to shift the trend. So this is the perfect time to start those discussions. And also, I think, and as you're sitting there rattling around, your brain is probably swimming from all that you've heard, it's pretty clear that this is actually a complex problem. There's not going to be one simple solution. And because a picture paints 1,000 words, this is my mind map that I drew up from what we heard today. And that is the issue of voter turnout and declining voter participation. And these are the things that we covered today in this conference. So let me go enlarge each one a bit. So who's not voting and why? Well, we heard from a lot of people today about the groups that are absent include Māori, young, Pacifica, and migrant communities. We also heard that we talk about people not voting. We have to remind ourselves that it's intermittent. They vote sometimes they don't vote. So there maybe are some people who never vote. There are other people who come and go depending on things like the closeness of an election, how far apart the parties are in terms of real party policy options in an election. But I think from this opening discussion about who's not voting, I took out probably 5 major themes. Actually 4 major themes. The first one is what's really scary about this is that we know voting is a habit, and that what we're seeing is a generational shift. And what's happening is, once it's in train, it's very difficult to shift. And what we're experiencing now is a decline that comes from generational replacement, which is a nice way of saying, as the younger generation replaces the older generation, it really does explain the downward trend. And that is a scary thing. A second theme that arose today is the powerful overlapping effects that we've seen that explains why voter turnout is decreasing. So yes, there's overlap between young Māori, Pacifica, and migrant communities, but more than that, we're also seeing an overlap in the effects that we also talk about. So things, the socioeconomic. Can you actually see that at all? Oh, there's no way of enlarging it, is there? So you've got age off to the left, but it also overlaps with socioeconomic. It overlaps with education. And we also heard the issue of ethnicity arising today. We also heard about the fact that these groups that don't vote tend to be economically, socially marginalized, and that leads to a political marginalization, and that creates a vicious circle. Also, relative deprivation was a really important issue, and social inequality that was raised, both at the level of an individual and also as a group, which also plays into the whole issue of ethnicity. But lastly, the thing that was repeated today was it's dangerous to lump groups together. So we talk about young, we talk about migrant communities, and with each different group that we talk about who are absent, it's really important to remember that we don't lump these people together, that we actually think very carefully about segmenting and targeting properly. And for that, we need to know a bit more about the reasons who's not voting and why they're not voting. See, I've had, it's been a very interesting day and lots that's been discussed. So in terms of the effects, what has an effect on voting turnout, what I've done here is just basically divide it up between individual, attitudinal, context of the election, and institutional factors. And at some point today, every one of these things has been discussed. So just looking at that picture and seeing the number of things that impact on voter turnout, surely what that indicates to people, when we get to the next thing that we need to talk about, which is what's to be done, there's not going to be one simple answer. It's going to take a multifaceted approach to actually make a significant change in terms of voter turnout. And changes and the solutions rather than the problems was actually the main focus of today's conference. It's what the Electoral Commission at least hoped would come out of the conference, is not just more discussion on the problems, but actually a lot more discussion about what can actually be done. Because the problem is large, but the solutions can be bite-sized, and that makes it all the more easy, or at least it makes it something that seems doable to us. So what to do? Again, a lot of great things, great ideas today, and trying to step back and put them into some sort of order. I've just sort of put them out there as possible grouping of solutions. So where to start? Well, let's start with the institutional short-term things. Some things that we could actually perhaps do in the lead up to the election, but certainly, if not in time for this election, something in the short term. So one of the really important institutional things is around mobilization of voters. And we heard an awful lot about the mobilization of voters today. In terms of mobilizing voters, to go back to what Heather just said, first of all, you need to ask. One of the very basic studies in the US asked, why don't you vote? And they had the standard answers, no time, no interest. But then the third one was because no one asked me to. And how you ask is really important as well. And from what Heather was saying, what other people have said, something more personal and reaching out is far more likely to be successful. So you have to ask. How you ask is important. And demystifying the process. The startup costs of voting for the first time are actually really high, particularly for young people, because their peer group, they're among a whole bunch of people who haven't voted before. So demystifying the process is a really important first step. Political parties have long been one of the vehicles, or perhaps the most important vehicle, of mobilizing voters. And certainly they used to anchor voters into the political system. There was a time in New Zealand where roughly 1 in 4 voters belonged to a political party. It's down now closer to 3% of the entire voting population belongs to a party. So parties, though, we still expect to do a lot of the mobilization around voting time. So we had a really interesting discussion between Mark and Rob about how to mobilize people to make them interested in voting. A bit of discussion about, keeping it positive. Question of whether the carrot or the stick is the best way to get that sort of mobilization. Certainly closeness of election is important, and so the question was raised then, why don't parties more regularly announce ahead of time the blocks of the different parties to make it very clear that the election is close? Political parties also, it was raised, are not particularly good at engaging young people. That the catch-all style of political party, young people feel excluded from that. And so some of the ideas, and to go back to Heather's idea as well, people need to see themselves in the election, in the system. So it's really important, as Jen noted, for political parties to have young candidates, to talk about, to really listen to their views, not just come asking for their vote, and to talk about issues rather than ideology. And I know some of the groups that have formed are really forming around that idea. The media, though, is still the way that most people meet their politicians these days. And it's the way most people engage, in a sense, in politics. And when Claire spoke, she said, the media does have a responsibility to inform the voters, but not necessarily to mobilize them, to encourage turnout, which is an interesting thing to say. But what can the media do? Well, accurately reflect how close the election is. And by that means not just focusing on the 2 main parties, National and Labour, because, for example, in the last election, it was declared a foregone conclusion. Well, when the specials were counted, it was actually a lot closer than anyone realized. So accurately reflecting how close it is, and also perhaps recognizing that we are not just a 2-party system anymore. We are a multi-party system, and leaders' debates perhaps could include more than just the 2 major parties. So in terms of longer-term institutional changes, online voting has been raised. It's clear it's not a silver bullet, but I think it's coming. I think a lot of people expect to do things online. But the reality is the real time constraint, the real barrier of voting is still being informed well enough to vote with confidence. It's not so much the physical act of voting, it's having the information to know who you're going to vote for. So online voting won't clear that up for people, but certainly it may help in some ways to get some people to actually vote. Compulsory voting is, as I think David said, the closest thing we've got, and Jack said as well, the closest thing we've got to a silver bullet. I thought it was interesting, the idea of compulsory voting to be sweetened with none of the above, which is a very interesting idea, because it means that people can actually register their protest. The voting age is another possible change that we've talked about. Attitudes goes together with civics education. What do we need to do in terms of engaging the population better and to create that sense of citizenship or the culture of voting that we need for voters to be fully engaged, a sense of belonging. Behavioral change, very clearly what we need. It's very clear what we need to do to get behavioral change. We need to understand the audience, tailor the message. We need to segment, do lots of research. But the biggest thing is we really need time and money to do this, which means we need to think that voting turnout is a priority. And we also need to have a whole of government, a whole of civil society approach to make it happen. So let me finish with the last thing, which is the reform of our Westminster style of representative democracy. How do we fatten up our democracy that seems to be thinning? Well, one idea is to bolt on, to complement representative democracy with more engaged democracy in between elections. And I think that's a really good idea. We also need to think about fostering participation through local government, through civics education. I don't know, I think probably most of the young people in the room at least saw that rant of Russell Brand, yes? And then the interview afterwards with Jeremy Paxman, where Parliament was described as a remote and self-important echo chamber. And to me, that really did sort of capture what particularly I think young people feel about Parliament and how it operates. And we really need to think very carefully about how we open up our representative democracy in all sorts of interesting ways. So today was only ever meant to be a tasting plate. It was never meant to be the full or main course. So what comes next is really important. It was a great taster plate, and what was so exciting is to see the mix of people who are here. It's people who study turnout from an academic viewpoint. It's the activists. It's the people who are living it. It's great to see so many young people here. It's great to see New Zealand's full diversity, rich diversity, reflected here. So this is the start. I hope you'll create networks today, and let's follow this up on an ongoing basis with some more in-depth conversations about what we can do to improve turnout.